to record. We are very pleased this morning to have Georgina join us from the Center for the Study of let me pull up my screen here though, because for some reason, why is that doing that? Oh, okay, there we go, sorry. Okay, here we go. Currently, Georgina is a research associate of the University of Gloucestershire. She has studied female characters in the Quran from a Christian perspective and has research interests in scriptural reasoning and the intersection of religion and women's studies. Originally from Southern Africa, she has taught secondary and tertiary education in the UK and South Africa, including Introduction to Islam, Christian-Muslim relations, and scriptural engagement at various colleges. She has contributed to conferences on the topics of female characterization in the Bible and Quran and methods of scriptural engagement. Her most recent research projects include a survey of Christian-Muslim encounters in the documentation of 19th century Scottish explorer David Livingstone. The other thing that Georgina does is she's on our Academic Advisory Council at OCMS, and we're very pleased to get her insight in so many of the things that we do. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Georgina to go ahead and give her lecture. Good.
Thank you, Tom. I have so much that I want to share with you this morning that it was difficult to fit a title around what I actually wanted to present. So I'm afraid Tom might have to cut me off halfway, but I'm going to give it my best shot, and I'm just going to go over to sharing my screen, which I hope you can see. It's a PowerPoint presentation just to give you something else to look at while we have this presentation this morning. And just to say initially, the title was around Mission as Foundation for the Divine Collaboration. And what I'm going to talk about today is a project that we had at the Center for Muslim Christian Studies to develop a sister center in Africa, in Ghana. And we collaborated with Dr. John Azuma to establish that. He might be known to some of you. And the initiative that he has started in Ghana is known as the Sane Institute. And so I'll just share some pictures of an inauguration event that we had at the end of February to inaugurate the Sane Institute. But just on this title then, although mission, the word mission doesn't feature anywhere in our titles, either of the conferences or of the institutions, I would just like to say that at the heart of this, these collaborations was a sense of being called to serve the nations. And so mission is the foundation for these collaborations. Here is a picture of the inaugural event on the Saturday, 29th of February, where we had Rowan Williams and Farid Esak as keynote speakers. And we also had the family of Lamin Sane, in whose honor the Sane Institute is named. So it's named after Lamin Sane, and his widow and family were present there as well. This particular picture is when Lamin's son was delivering a speech. And this was at the University of Ghana with all the dignitaries that you could almost amass together in Ghana. It was a really auspicious event. And so just to point out, the logo of the Sane Institute is of conjoined crocodiles. And the idea of these conjoined crocodiles is that they represent Christians and Muslims. So the one crocodile being Christians and the other one being Muslims, but they're joined at the stomach. And so they need each other to survive, or they can both thrive together or they can starve together, is the idea. It is a West African symbol. And importantly, preceding this event, we had a 3-day conference in Ghana. And the title of this academic conference was really focusing on how Christians and Muslims can learn to live together, and the key issues there being territory that is shared, and to what extent hospitality is shared, and to what extent our traditions of hospitality can either facilitate or make it difficult for us to share that territory. And so this is a picture then of some of the participants there. And as you can see, this is a conference that brought Muslims and Christians together in the same space, in the same territory, and hosted by the Center for Muslim Christian Studies and the Sane Institute together. And just our 3-day conference was brought together at the end by our what we called keynote listeners. And you might recognize Dr. Ida Glaser of the Center for Christian Muslim Studies, and Professor Andrew Walls, who were our keynote listeners that brought the conference to a close. And I just my own personal reflection on that moment, that time together, was a real moment where Christians and Muslims sat in absolute silence, just riveted by the wisdom of these two speakers. And the comments from our Muslim participants afterwards on their perspectives that they found very insightful, and some were using the language of transformational and life-changing. So what I just want to present to you this morning is to introduce the Sane Institute to you and this collaboration between our center and the Ghana Center. And then just the paper that I presented at this conference was a reflection on David Livingstone's writings and how Muslims feature in his writings as a thinking around the sharing of territory. So you might want to shift around how the images, how the zoom influences perhaps what you see on the screen. So this is just an extract of some of the presentation that I made at this conference on the sharing of territory. And the image that you see on your screen at the moment is the famous meeting between David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley, when Stanley had gone to look for Livingstone, who had basically disappeared for 5 years or so, and people had presumed him dead. And so here he is donning his cap to David and saying, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, is the legendary quote. But the thing that I actually want to point out is, although this image has been reproduced so many times, I found so many different iterations of this image, I'm not sure where it originated and who was the original artist who sketched this. But if you look behind David Livingstone, the context within which he is placed is very much the Arab traders, or the what were generally described as Arab traders or Muslims, as his setting, whereas the people who are surrounding Stanley are supposedly indigenous African inhabitants. And so it is rather a wonder that no one has paid much attention to David Livingstone's relationships with Muslims as religionists on his travels. Although, you know, of course, a lot has been made of the Arab travelers, mostly slave traders with whom he traversed around southeastern Africa. Not much has been made of his views on Islam or his reflections on them as Muslims per se. And so that's what I'd like to highlight a little bit here. So in today's presentation, I will highlight Livingstone's presentation of Muslims in his writings in different genres of his manuscripts. Firstly, to highlight his observations about Islam and Muslims as a feature of his work. And secondly, I bring a question to what extent there is a discrepancy between Livingstone's first-hand experiences and observations in his field diaries and the way that these are then presented to a European audience in some of his later publications. And I hope to stimulate some thinking about how missionary observations are presented to the home or the sending audience, and to what extent these may be shaped not so much by the observations of the missionary, but by the expectations of the home audience. So just to say a little bit about the sources that I used, I'll just move on, I'll come back to this slide. There is a repository online called the Livingstone Online Project, and for those of you who are interested in David Livingstone and his legacy, I cannot recommend this highly enough. It's a project that brings together his manuscripts from across the world and has digitized it and made it available online for free. And so you can look at Livingstone's handwritten sketches, his field diaries, search for different elements in his work online in the Livingstone Online Project. And then what I do is to compare with these access to his online diaries to what was published in the last journals of David Livingstone. There were 2 volumes called The Last Journals of David Livingstone in Central Africa. And just to give you the description on the front page of both these journals is a continued in a narrative of his last moments and sufferings, narrated from his faithful servants, Chuma and Susi. Now this is the 2 porters who brought Livingstone's body to Westminster or to Britain. They were responsible for transporting his remains to Britain. James Chuma and Abdullah Susi. Now there once again we see the involvement of someone from a Muslim background, Abdullah Susi, together with James Chuma, who was a Christian, and these 2 collaborating to return Livingstone's remains to Britain. But so these were Livingstone's first-hand observations were then put together in this narrative by his editor, Horace Waller, who published them, importantly for us to realize that these were published posthumously. So they were not published in Livingstone's lifetime. They were redacted and edited by Horace Waller after his demise, Livingstone's demise. And just to point out, one of the things that we find in the online website is Livingstone's writing up of a very important event, for us reflecting on Christian-Muslim relations in Livingstone's writings, which was the Manyuema Market Massacre, as it's known, or the Nyangwe Massacre, that was found thanks to this the project that brought all sorts of digital skills together. And this is a spectral image of David Livingstone's writing up of that event. By that time, he didn't have any ink left, and he had written in an ink that he had devised from local berries. And he'd written on newspaper, which was the only materials available to him at that stage. And so thanks to spectral imaging, it was possible to see this writing again, where Livingstone records the events of that massacre. So that's just a bit about the sources. So if we then look at some of the descriptions that Livingstone gives of Muslims in his writings, just to say that he came into contact with Muslims as he traveled the Indian Ocean and inland towards the east coast of Central Africa. He comments on their activities in his diaries and other writings from the late 1850s onwards. So this is after his publication of Missionary Travels. His reports on the whole reflect complex relationships with Muslims. He encounters them as traders and fellow travelers who assist him with supplies, translations, and territorial knowledge at the same time as he was promoting the abolition of the slave trade in East Africa. Livingstone talks about Muslims in ethnographic terms. He calls them variously Arabs or the Swahili, the typical Victorian term Mahometan or Mohammedans or Muslims. These are all found interchangeably in his writings. The other way to identify when he talks about Muslims as well is simply to look for Muslim names that seem to be Muslim, such as the name Muhammad or Sayyid. He describes behaviors, practices, and beliefs of Muslims as he encounters them, and sometimes he comments on the basis of missiological interest, together with preconceptions about Islam. However, his reflections on practices and beliefs are mostly those of a participant observer. He doesn't always follow up his observations by a comparison with Christianity or by some theological evaluation. So ethnic differences are noted often in the context of Livingstone's assessment of anthropological behavior. For instance, he describes some of the Arabs on Lake Nyassa as very civil in one of his letters, while the coast Arabs, manners and morals would be no improvement on the pagan African, is in another comment. Livingstone delivers comment in typical Victorian expression, often exhibiting the attitudes and worldview familiar in 19th century Britain. For example, a certain Musa is described together with his companions as, I quote, fair average specimens for heartlessness and falsehood of the lower classes of Mohammedans in East Africa. He reveals a scientific curiosity in all aspects of religious, social, and medical life of those around him. He's also willing to participate in several practices. For instance, he expresses no hesitation to share food and to partake in meals that have been prepared according to halal practice, while he does not name them as such. Rather, he almost always shows appreciation for his inclusion in meals. At a Muslim celebration, most likely to be Eid al-Adha, Livingstone recounts, the Arabs made a sort of sacrifice of a goat, which was cooked all at once. They sent a good dish of it to me. They read the Quran very industriously and prayed for success or luck in leaving, and seem sincerely religious, according to the light that is in them. And then he says, the use of incense and sacrifices brings back the old Jewish times to mind. I'm not sure why he made that link with Judaism. At a later similar event, he again comments that the cookery is of their very best, and I always get a share. Livingstone notes differences within religion, comparing not only the distinctions between Islam and Christianity, but sectarian differences within Islam that he encountered. So he says, an old Monyinko headman presented a goat and asked if the sepoys wished to cut its throat. The Johannese, being of a different sect of Mohammedans, wanted to cut it in some other way than their Indian co-religionists. Then ensued a fierce dispute as to who was of the right sort of Muslim. It was interesting to see that not Christians alone, but other nations feel keenly on religious subjects. So he relates that then to Christian arguments. Livingstone seems to have engaged in regular comparative discussions with Muslims. In an entry on the 4th of April 1871, he says, "The Arabs ask many questions about the Bible and want to know how many prophets have appeared, and probably say that they believe in them all, while we believe it all but reject Muhammad." Livingstone then claims that their knowledge is lacking in response to detailed questioning by himself. And he argues, or he points out, that it's easy to drive them into a corner by questioning, as they don't know whither the inquiries lead, and they are not offended when their knowledge is, as it were, admitted. When asked how many false prophets are known, they appeal to my knowledge, and evidently never heard of Balaam, the son of Beor, or of the 250 false prophets of Jezebel and Ahab, which just shows us a little bit that Livingstone isn't really familiar with the contents of the Quran. So he really argues from a biblical basis rather than from what he knows from the Quran. At the same time, there's a relative sense of self-awareness and fair-minded assessment of different worldviews in his accounts, while Livingstone assesses Islam as a competitor, as a missionary competitor. So in one of his comments about during an expedition to the Zambezi, he says, "So far as we could learn, no efforts have been made to convert the natives to Islam, though these two Arabs and about a dozen half-castes had been in the country for many years. And judging from our experience with a dozen Mohammedans in our employ at high wages for 16 months, the Africans would be the better men in proportion as they retained their native faith." He then goes on to say, "This may appear only a harsh judgment from a mind imbued with Christian prejudice, but without any pretension to that impartiality which leaves it doubtful to which side the affections lean. The truth may be fairly stated by one who viewed all Mohammedans and Africans with the sincerest goodwill." In an implicit application of the parable of the Good Samaritan, Livingstone identifies a Muslim benefactor with the Samaritan of the parable. He says, he describes a situation where my property had been sold to Sharif's friends at merely nominal prices. Sayyid bin Majid, a good man, proposed that they should be returned and the ivory be taken from Sharif. But they would not restore the stolen property, though they knew it to be stolen. Then he says, Christians would have acted differently, even those of the lowest classes. I felt in my destitution as if I were the man who went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among the thieves. But I could not hope for priest, Levite, or Good Samaritan to come by on either side. But one morning, Sayyid bin Majid said to me, "Now this is the first time we've been alone together. I have no goods, but I have ivory. Let me, I pray you, sell some ivory and give the goods to you." And so Sayyid bin Majid is his, in this sense then, is his benefactor, and he perceives himself to be the one who had fallen among thieves. Livingstone often comments on Muslim individuals, distinguishing between friends and helpers and those he perceived to be untrustworthy or idle. But one figure in particular perhaps shows the ambivalent as well as the changing relationship that Livingstone has with Muslims. The most consistent Muslim travel companion in Livingstone's accounts is Muhammad Bukharib, also sometimes referred to as Muhammad ibn Kharib. an Arab trader who facilitated much of Livingstone's travel from their meeting on 21 November 1867 onwards. Critical studies claim that the relationship between Livingstone and his Arab companions is based on a combination of opportunism and ill-tempered relations with European agents. And this may be borne out by these accounts where Bugharib is involved, and where it's clear that Livingstone relies on Bugharib's negotiating skills and his geographical knowledge to facilitate his own explorations. Yet, Livingstone and Bugharib also seem to have shared mutual interests, at least from the perspective of Livingstone. For instance, Livingstone excuses a ruse by Bugharib to get out of a difficulty with a local chieftain that cost Livingstone 5 months' delay. Extraordinarily, he equates Christian and Muslim pragmatism in his remark that the deception, he was deceived by Bugharib, which delayed him, in Livingstone's words, is not to be wondered at, and in a Mohammedan and in a Christian too, is thought clever. Livingstone would allow himself to be delayed several more times on behalf of Bugharib, once citing no particular reason apart from Bugharib's kindness. Livingstone says, "I prepared to start today, but Muhammad Bugharib has been very kind and indeed cooked meals for me from my arrival. The food was coarse enough, but still it was food, and I did not like to refuse his genuine hospitality. He now begged of me not to go for 3 days, and then he would come along with me." Muhammad Bugharib, on his part, seems to be concerned over Livingstone when his health deteriorates. So Livingstone's entries on 9 January 1869 show some affectionate care given by Bugharib. He says, "Muhammad Bugharib came up, and I've got a cupper who cupped my chest." The next day he writes, "Muhammad Bugharib offered to carry me." Livingstone appreciates the care, writing that Bugharib is very kind to me in my extreme weakness, supplying me with medicines. And then at Christmas that year, Bugharib presents Livingstone's party with a goat. As a matter of fact, his relationship seems so close that a news clipping from the time reports on Livingstone, and I found this clipping stuck to one of the pages, but I can't see from which newspaper it originated. But the clipping is there saying, "The Arabs there count him as a resident, and in the region no feeling is manifested towards him." So interestingly, that this newspaper clipping reports on Livingstone as "the Arabs there count him as a resident." However, the question about his ultimate or his real views on Muslims is brought into question by an apparent disparity between his initial observations in the field diaries and their eventual redaction and presentation in the last journals. In the last journals, there is a section where the evaluation of Muslim morals is presented within an overriding perspective of Christian mission and intermittently with Islam as a competitor in mind. Especially towards the end, the last journals, volume 2, engages in longer discourses about Islam and challenges to Christian mission in territories that are shared by Muslims. It attributes the obstacles to Christian mission in these regions to a sense of confidence among Muslims and places any progress of Christian mission in terms of relationships with the Ottoman Empire, noting that the expansion of missionary enterprise might be permitted under the sway of the Sultan of Zanzibar in a typical example of British colonial practice. And so we see here then that Livingstone's life and career intersects with 19th century views of Islam. Victorian attitudes were shaped variously by the rational disputation initiated by Henry Martyn, translator of the Bible into Arabic and other languages in early 19th century. And then deist appreciation of Islamic republicanism in the English Enlightenment by such figures as Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Edmund Burke, and Mary Shelley. However, the Indian Mutiny of 1857 arguably shifted the spectrum of opinions about Islam to become more hostile. So we see this movement from perhaps appreciation, on the one hand, missionary engagement with Islam, an appreciation of what's conceived to be Islamic republicanism by some, but then also events, political events like the mutiny. And then all of this, of course, in the context of the Ottoman Empire, which is still very much a reality of a Victorian life. And then just to point out this one event that we saw that was shown in the spectral imaging, Livingstone's views on the massacre, the Nyangwe massacre, does seem to color Livingstone's opinion. While his own conduct in the affair has been questioned, he is seen to make more generalized negative comments about Islam as a religion in the aftermath of that massacre, even in his personal correspondence. Further details of the event have become accessible through the spectral imaging, but we do see some comments in his field diaries of 1871. In a letter to John Kirk dated 25 March 1871, Livingstone writes that his spirits are beyond measure depressed in writing on such matters, and the event seems to constitute a turning point in his assessment of Islamic subjects. So in his reflections on the killing and the justification that is offered in religious terms by the slave traders, Livingstone insists that women were never touched until now by these Mohammedans. In the same letter to Kirk, he asserts that the Sultan should let any slave from Manyema go free, for they were not traded for, but murdered for. In talking with them, I always protest against shedding human blood, and then they think that rhyming over God is great and all sin is forgiven. So he's rather cynical there. In a further letter to John Kirk, in May 1871, he concludes, I never imagined that human or Mohammedan nature could be so atrociously vile. So while Livingstone was not unequivocally positive about Muslim conduct up to this point, his writings from 1871 onwards become more generalized reflections on the witness of faith in action, and he starts comparing more with the nature of Christianity and Islam. Even in one of his entries, or one of his letters, he writes, he makes an analogy between Muhammad and Moses, and then talks about some miracle. It must have been a local law about Muhammad, but then he calls Muhammad, sorry, I'm just looking for the space here. The only difference between their religion and them is that Muhammad lied to force his countrymen to give up idolatry, making a comparison between him and Paul. Livingstone does betray a sense of guilt over the massacre in describing the aftermath, saying, several market people came to salute who knew that we had no hand in the massacre, as we are different people from the Arabs. They speak of us as good. The anthropologists think that to be spoken of as wicked is better. Ezekiel says that the Most High put his comeliness upon Jerusalem. If he does not impart of his goodness to me, I shall never be good. If he does not put of his comeliness on me, I shall never be comely in soul, but be like these Arabs in whom Satan has full sway. And so we see here this very complicated trying to grappling with the events that he witnessed. Nevertheless, Livingstone includes some proponents of Islam, namely the Turks or the Ottomans, as potential allies in abolishing the slave trade, when in that rather famous quote he says, all I can add in my loneliness is, may heaven's rich blessing come down on everyone American, English, or Turk, who will help to heal the open sore of the world, referring to slavery. So to bring it to a close, these intellectual and political movements form the backdrop against which Livingstone documents his encounters with all, whether friend or foe, in his field diaries. His experiences were collated, redacted, and shaped as a narrative of his journeys by himself or his editors. While Livingstone's diary entries are certainly not always positive about Islam, and his redacted writings seem keenly aware of European expectations, he does differ in nuance from contemporary European writers in his comparative appreciation of Islam as a monotheistic faith and of Muslims as individuals. In contrast, Richard Burton anticipated an Islamic conquest of Africa, viewing Islam as a competing imperialist contender that permeates other compatriots' thinking and writing in the 1860s. So while Livingstone exhibits familiarity with these eschatological and premillennial anxieties about Islam, his close relationship with Muslim traders allows him a more pragmatic evaluation compared to what we might call armchair anthropologists. So we might describe Livingstone as both pragmatic and evangelistic. And he did not conclude that Islam was spreading itself by giant strides, as some of the others were arguing. He made the distinct observation in one of his earlier publications that there was very little effort by the Muslims he encountered to convert the local population. Yes, so just back to the last journals then, where it engages in longer discourses about Islam and challenges to Christian mission in territories shared by Muslims. He notes, there seems, so this is in the last journals, there seems but little prospect of Christianity spreading by ordinary means among Mohammedans. Their pride is a great obstacle and is very industriously nurtured by its votaries. No new invention or increase of power on the part of Christians seems to disturb the self-complacent belief that ultimately all power and dominion in this world will fall into the hands of Muslims. Muhammad will appear at last in glory with all his followers saved by him. When Mr. Stanley's Arab boy from Jerusalem told the Arab bin Saleh that he was a Christian, he was asked, "Why so? Don't you know that all the world will soon be Mohammedan? Jerusalem is ours, all the world is ours, and in a short time we shall overcome all." There's our great expectations. So this is from the last journals then. These comments seem to be rather at odds with Livingstone's field diary notes that esteems Islam to be a fading religious force in Africa. Thus it is a question to what extent the sentiments about Islam in the last journals may be attributed solely to Livingstone, and how much his views were edited by his editors Horace Waller and J. Murray after Livingstone's death, to be brought into line with abolitionist and imperial discourses immediately post-Livingstone. I did come across one Dutch scholar, Sjoerd Reitma, who wrote a book, David Livingstone and the Myth of African Poverty and Disease, and where he simply makes an observation saying that the last journals is a mutilated version of all Livingstone's notebooks and all his material, but he never explains why he thinks so. He doesn't say why he thinks it's mutilated. So in the end, it remains a question how much of the views about Islam in Livingstone's last journals are his own, or to what extent they've been adapted for a European audience. A further question is how much of these views were actually those of Horace Waller and his fellows, who were appropriating Livingstone's legacy for their abolitionist and imperial agendas. I will leave it there. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you, Georgina. For everyone else online, anyone who asks a question, please open up your participant side, and there will be a thing that says raise hand. And you can click on that, and I will call on you. So just as, I guess we'll start off, Georgina, talk a little bit about your title and how you see that relating to Livingstone in terms of mission as the basis of divine encounter, or yeah.
Yeah, so in looking at the legacy of David Livingstone, we see that he's, my apologies.
That's all right.
His legacy goes, it's such a roller coaster ride almost, where you have on the one hand what we might call hero worship of David Livingstone, certainly in terms of his missionary endeavors and his role in the abolition of the slave trade. But then, of course, over time, he becomes associated with the colonial project, even though Livingstone, remember, he dies in 1873, before what's known as the Scramble for Africa in 1881. But he becomes associated with that, with the colonial project. Yes, so his endeavors towards the end of his life, even though he set out what we might see as set out as a missionary initially, he is known to have moved on to the Royal Geographic Society from the London Missionary Society, and there is a question to what extent he saw himself, or really his goals were missionary goals in the end. But in looking at his relationship with Muslims, you can see that mission is still very much there at the heart of even his expedition to find the source of the Nile. He never relinquishes the missionary foundation. I suppose that's what I would want to say about mission as foundation.
I don't see any hands raised, so still waiting on that, so please raise your hand. Let me take that to the next step. We, looking backwards, will look at texts like Livingstone's and his interaction and do a bit of discernment and dividing between missionary versus colonialism. But don't you get a sense that human beings grow up within a milieu where the two get so entangled that they don't necessarily see a difference between mission and the colonial project? I think of that in terms of my own family, because my father was the son of missionaries. And then he moved into law, and he saw in a very kind of triumphalistic way that what mission was is trying to bring democracy to the whole world. But he fused the two worlds, that the manifest destiny was somehow part of mission itself, and how that was understood in terms of the text he read. He didn't distinguish the two. Do you think Livingstone did distinguish the two?
No, I don't think he distinguished between the two. I think that is our, us looking back from our 20th and 21st century vantage points and seeing how the colonial project played out. So in our reflections, we can look back on that and see how Livingstone prepared the way in a sense that he never could,
right,
looking forward. So the world that he was swimming in was very much, and I use this idea of the world that he was swimming in the metaphor that we often use is fish swimming water, they don't know any different.
That's right. Well, good, thank you. I'm turning now to Tim Keen. Tim, you've been unmuted, or unmute your microphone.
Yeah, I may have misheard, but you seem to be saying at one point that David Livingstone contrasted Moses and Muhammad in that Muhammad lied. And I was wondering if I got that right, what was he referring to when he said that Muhammad lied?
Well, that's so. This I was just reading a quote from his diary, saying that both produced miracles, but Moses produced the miracle of the water, whereas Muhammad produced, and this is what I'm not sure. I've never come across a hadith or a legend of Muhammad producing water in Mecca. But that Livingstone simply just says, obviously Muhammad's was a lie, whereas Moses's was in truth. He doesn't justify the statement to say why he thinks it's a lie. It simply seems to be within this assessment of Islam as originating in what one might call false pretenses, perhaps.
Okay.
Okay, good. We will now turn to John Padwick. John, I'm unmuting your microphone. Go ahead, John.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that presentation. Really very interesting. Could you fill us out, please, a little bit more about what happened at that massacre, the name of which I have forgotten. I mean, I didn't pick it up. And because it seems to have sparked a lot of reflection afterwards on Livingstone's part, and talk a little bit about whether he was even thinking of himself as in some way implicated.
Can I unmute myself? Thank you.
Yeah, unmute yourself.
So yes, I'm never quite sure when I'm talking to a distinguished missiological audience like yourself how much detail of David Livingstone I need to share, because he is what we might call our Protestant saint. But the Nyangwe massacre, so that's Nyangwe, Nyangwe, or it's also called Manyuema Market Massacre, was an event where he and these Arab traders had taken up in the Nyangwe village, and there was some scuffle or a dispute, and these Arab traders then started shooting at the village inhabitants, and Livingstone describes how especially the women and children fled into the river. They had nowhere else to go, fled into the river, but even as they were falling into the water, these traders didn't stop shooting. And he estimates that approximately 400 people were killed, who were mostly women and children. And he does say in one of his entries that he had tried to call them towards him because he knew the Arab traders wouldn't shoot at him. And so he had tried to beckon the fleeing women and children towards him. Still, he witnessed this massacre of what he says was 400 people in the village by his fellow travelers, these Arab traders, slave traders, who were he was traveling with them. And so he was associated with them for good or for ill.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Ben, unmuting you. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. The interchangeability of Arabs and Swahilis and Muslims is not complete, because there was something of a distinction, not a total distinction, between Arab and Swahili. Those who could get capital for the vast safaris far inland would of course needed the patronage of the Sultan of Zanzibar, and they would tend to be Omani Arabs. But Swahilis were people who who grew up on the coast and were Muslim and spoke a very different language from Arabic, even though there are a large number of Arab loanwords in it, about a third or even a half. So Swahilis generally were an admixture of African, coastal Africans and those who they enslaved from the interior. Those, of course, who wanted to claim a higher status would claim that they were Arabs, or whatever the color of their skin. But by and large, the Swahilis were known as quite a heterogeneous people along the East African coast, and really couldn't claim to be Arabs. So as the slave trade, ivory trade, gun trade increased in East Africa towards the turn of the century, you did get Swahili-led caravans. So I expect Livingstone himself was quite well aware of the distinction between Arab and Swahili. And the other question mark I would put in, simply by their dress, can you be completely sure that the white-robed gentlemen behind Livingstone were not, in fact, Christians who had to be clothed, and this was before the time of the import of European clothes, and therefore could be expected to be wearing white, long garments, which of course transposed into the Kanzu in Uganda. That's my question.
I'm not taking these as absolutes, and certainly Livingstone himself makes ethnographic differences in his descriptions of the Swahili and Arab, and that is why I'm using the term Muslim, because we've not really paid attention to Livingstone's observation of their religion. We've paid a lot of attention to these distinctions, these ethnic distinctions, and I absolutely grant that. But in terms of considering Livingstone's relationship with Islam and Muslims, that is what I meant with using the term Swahili. So what I was looking for was his comment on Islam, and these were usually associated with these different terms, either describing the Swahili or describing Arab or Mohammedan or Muslim, as usually as the Victorian writing convention, not Muslim as we would refer to it today.
Do you think the change over time is due more to Livingstone learning about what Muslims were up to? And of course they were not indigenous in any sense of the African interior, unless they'd been a slave themselves. And whether it was the Muslims who were changing their practices.
Do you mean in terms of Islam?
Not in terms of Islam, in terms of how much Livingstone rated Islam as a civilizing or whatever process. So there's two. You're saying here there is a discrepancy of his description of Muslims, and the turning point is 1871. Could this be due to Livingstone learning more about Muslims and losing a sort of romantic filter from his eyes, or the Muslims were becoming worse in their caravanning habits?
So I don't think that he had necessarily had romantic ideas about the Arab traders, because his very early comments about especially the trader Jumbe in Malawi. For those of you who've been to Malawi, there's still the very famous fig tree under which Livingstone supposedly met with the slave trader Jumbe. Very early on, this was already in the 1860s, and where he is trying to negotiate with Jumbe to free slaves. So he's not unaware of what they're doing, and that is why people have made critical assessments of Livingstone himself for knowingly making use of the local knowledge, the geographical knowledge of the Arab traders, and then traveling with them, and in that way being associated with them to what extent they were using Livingstone, who was known as an abolitionist, to enter into village, to gain entrance into villages, where they would then capture the local population. At some stage when he's visiting Jumbe, he says, as we approach, we see the people in shackles who are then quickly removed and put behind the trees because they knew that we do not appreciate this sight. So there's so he is aware of their activities. He is trying to promote abolition, but I do think the Nyangwe massacre then really, in a sense, where he witnesses firsthand the cruelty and the murder by the hands of his fellow travelers.
Okay, let's turn to Stuart now. And Stuart, you are unmuted.
Thank you. And let me also put my video on now I've finished my coffee. That was very fascinating. My attention wavered at some point, so forgive me if you said this and I didn't catch it. But I got the point that there's uncertainty about how much of what's in the last journals is really the work of Waller. I'm not really clear about how many of your arguments depend on Waller and how many depend on Livingstone's earlier writings, for which he was presumably more directly responsible. So could you perhaps say that again for my benefit anyway? And a sort of add-on question is, how much do we know about Waller's reliability as the sort of person who distinguished between what he thought and what Livingstone actually said? I know about Waller only that he was in East Africa in a part of it called the Shire Highlands for some time, but I don't know much more than that.
So one of the things I don't want to do is to paint Waller as a kind of a villain that just appropriated Livingstone's materials for his own purposes, because I don't think that was the case. If we look at the way that Livingstone collaborated with Murray for the missionary travels, and it is, in their correspondence, one can see how they are negotiating what needs to be included and excluded, and what Livingstone wanted to present. Livingstone wanted to present the more scientific findings of his travels, whereas Murray wanted to present a more narrative approach in terms of the missions narrative in the missionary travels. So we do see Livingstone working with his editors, and that's why I don't want to say that this was merely Waller using and abusing Livingstone's materials for his own purposes. However, it is, we mustn't lose sight that these are published posthumously after Livingstone dies. So they're published in 1874. Livingstone is buried in 1873. So, and immediately, even some have written about Livingstone's legacy being even shaped at his funeral. You know, the extent to which he already at his funeral becomes a mythical figure. Perhaps even during the time that he had disappeared, the 5 years that he had disappeared in Africa before Stanley finds him, we get this development of Livingstone as a legendary figure, who then becomes important in the abolitionist arguments in British Parliament, and also the colonial projects. So, and that together with the diplomatic relations with the Ottoman Empire, you know, to as I say, the assessment, I would say the assessment Livingstone makes of Islam is that it is a fading missionary force, not necessarily a political force, but a fading missionary force in Africa. But that's not what you get from the last journals. The last journals present Islam as a threatening context in Africa.
Thank you.
Okay, we will turn now to Mark Oxborough. Mark, you're unmuted.
Thank you, Georgina. It's given me an appetite to read a bit more on Livingstone, which I've not done a huge amount about. You've just been talking about Islam as a missionary force. My question was really about how Livingstone saw, or really who he saw as the objects for mission. I don't like the word objects, but that's probably the best word to use here. I've dipped into Waller's work, and there he's often critical of Islam, or of Muslims rather than Islam, of Muslims in terms of morality, and he at one point says that there's no point in native people converting to Islam because they would be in a worse moral state than they were, you know, and the Muslims don't behave any better than the natives, as it were. But do you feel that he had an equal vocation calling to share the gospel with Muslims as well as with native people, or did he, like some of his age who had a different approach to thinking that those that had that were part of Islam had an adequate religion already, and so you should focus on those that only had a pagan approach to life?
See, that's one of the things that's very difficult to extract from the last journals. Were those Waller's views? Because that's exactly the assessment that he gives in Livingstone's words.
Yeah.
In the last journals, is this idea that we should be focusing on the African inhabitants, the native African inhabitants, and their pagan beliefs, as it was termed, rather than the Muslims who, and this is also from his field diaries, he expresses, when he's pushed by Muslims to say, what do you think of Muhammad? He says, well, at least he turned his people away from idolatry, and he turned them towards the one God. So he does have that is there in his original writings, is this, as you said, the idea that they're already halfway there. They have a somewhat of a sufficient religion. But he nevertheless is always engaging them in conversation. So, you know, those conversations about the prophets. And then he would also, when they ask him about his faith, at one time he gives this description that he doesn't identify himself as a Christian. He calls himself a follower of Isa ibn Maryam.
Right.
and so there he's then aware of the presentation of Jesus in Islam and in the Quran. And so that is how he wants to identify himself to Muslims.
Interesting, yeah.
And also another point he observes, they greet each other with marhaba, but I prefer to say salam. So, you know, the more pious expression,
Yes.
greeting, and always trying to open the door for discussion. But it's not clear to me that he made, you know, that he saw both native Africans and Muslims as equal objects of mission.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ben,
Yes, this idea that Livingstone should have had no truck with the Muslims in Eastern Africa is simply born of ignorant anachronism. If you wanted to travel into Central Africa, there was no other way. You had to have a safari filled with Arabs and Swahilis, or Swahilis. You simply couldn't get there. I mean, it would be like saying, well, I'm not going to go by railway to Nairobi in 1900 because it's an imperial project, and there were anti-imperialists around in those days. Of course, people went by railway because the alternative was far too risky. So Livingstone had no choice but to do that. Now, there's an interesting feature about Livingstone, which you touched on, in that in order to finance these enormous caravans which were necessary with either hired servants or slaves, were given 60-pound loads to carry on their head. And of course, in order to feed the safari, they had to carry their food, so it just multiplied into hundreds. He was so motivated to set up caravans that he needed money, and that encouraged his desire to please the Royal Geographical Society and to make the most out of advertising slavery, because anti-slavery, especially after 1831, was the catch-call of the British Empire. We are now against slavery. So the more Livingstone wrote to Britain about the evils of slavery in Africa, and look at these horrible Muslims who are doing it, the more money and attention that he could attract. So the problem with Livingstone and his poor old wife, whom he neglected, was that he rather relegated his missionary call to a severe attack of celebrititis. Don't you think so?
I want to be a little bit more forgiving towards Livingstone. I just think it's very easy from our 21st century vantage point, looking back over colonial expressions and in the post-colonial time, to ascribe cynical motives to him. I think he certainly, I would certainly agree with your assessment of he used what was available to him, and that's why he made use of the slave trade routes, because they were already open. He could have taken the more difficult way of traveling with perhaps befriending native travelers, but
that wasn't an option.
I would say, was utterly pragmatic. And when the Royal Geographic Society funded him, well, then that's the agenda that he then followed. But I wouldn't say that he that meant that he was derelict in his missionary motivation.
Okay, let's go to Al because we only have so much more time. Al, go ahead.
Yes, and simply because I also need to leave the meeting, because in Chile, of course, it's 7. In Latin America, we have a very small but growing and increasingly mission-oriented or evangelistic, or whatever you want to call it, a mission population, very small. Chile, hardly any. There's a group in Iquique in the north who tried to start a mosque, and then there was a great earthquake, and the only way they could rush to was the local YWAM people who took them in and loved them. I mean, it's a strange relationship we have with them here. But I was fascinated, a bit like Dr. Ben was just talking. Did Livingstone, is there any record of him entering into active conversation with the Muslims about slavery? I was fascinated and learned a lot this morning about Livingstone and slavery. I knew that he was part of this, but it's quite early on in this whole debate. But did he have a lot of, I probably missed it, I don't know if you actually said it, but did he actually engage them directly about slavery, the Muslims around him?
So if I could just, if I could answer that question by sharing my screen and just showing you a picture that my father sent me. My father is a native-born Malawian, and let me just get that onto the PowerPoint, sorry. So this is a monument in Malawi today that commemorates the coming of the slave trade. So this mosque commemorates the slave, well, not commemorates it, but it's really about the Jumbe family. So this is on Lake Malawi in the town of Nkhotakota, which is where Livingstone met Jumbe. So it says the place was founded by Jumbe, who came from Zanzibar and settled in Nkhotakota. And Livingstone explicitly negotiated with him to try and end Jumbe's slave trading. So he tried to get him involved in other activities, other economic activities. He made use of Jumbe's networks to cross Lake Nyasa and his boats, but he was very explicit about it. And as I say, to this day, there's this fig tree in Nkhotakota, which is supposedly where Jumbe and Livingstone made an agreement to end the slave trade. It wasn't successful because Jumbe broke the treaty, which was then later on, as it says here on I think on this this little what shall we call it, monument, that it said he was deposed and banished by the British government, who wanted to stop the slave trade to Zanzibar in 1895.
This is my question: is how successful was he with this? And it seems that he wasn't very successful in influencing Muslims to stop slave trading.
Yeah. No, he certainly attempted, and he did not manage to put an end to it. And as I said, he makes the remarks himself that where he had become known as an abolitionist, they simply tried to hide their activities from him. So
he shamed them at least. He shamed them at least.
Yeah. They certainly. Yeah.
Many blessings.
Let's draw this to a close. Thank you, Georgina, for an excellent lecture. This is recorded so that if anyone is interested or knows anyone who would like to go through it and receive it, we have it from beginning and end. Just a note, what you could call it is a historical marker. Then so then it can be a bad thing and still mark it. But anyway, thank you, Georgina. And thank you all for attending. And next week, we'll have Michael Nasr Ali speaking. So we look forward to you joining us for that. So I will now end the meeting.